Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're tackling something, well, a little unexpected. We're going to explore the intersection of storytelling, truth, and, believe it or not, TikTok.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, get ready to have your mind blown, because we're about to discover how ancient parables might just be the original viral content and what that means for us today.
It all begins with how our source material breaks down the way Jesus used parables. You know, the short, relatable stories with clear moral lessons. It's like they were the ancient world's version of a TikTok, quick, impactful messages, designed for maximum engagement.
I never thought about it that way. It's true.
Right.
And the source even points out that these parables were often around 40 seconds long, which really got me thinking, is that just a coincidence? Or are we hardwired to absorb information best in these bite-sized pieces? I mean, think about it. Are you more likely to watch a whole TikTok or, say, sit through a long lecture?
That's a fascinating question. And it gets even more interesting when the source starts exploring the whole concept of truth. It highlights how some people, like the Romans and Pharisees, saw Jesus as a manipulator because his teachings really challenged their authority.
Right, they didn't like what he was saying.
Exactly. But others, of course, saw him as a truth teller whose words resonated deeply.
So it seems like even way back then, people grappled with the idea of relative truth. Who gets to decide what's true? How much does our own perspective and context influence what we believe?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Even something like slavery, which was accepted for centuries, is now universally condemned. This concept of relative truth, the idea that what's considered true can change over time, is crucial to understanding how history is written and, frankly, how we form our own beliefs today. Have you ever noticed how ideas that were once really controversial can become totally mainstream over time?
Totally. I mean, all the time. Yeah. That's a really good point. And this brings us to a point the source makes about how future generations might look back at our current norms and values with the same kind of bewilderment we feel when we examine, practices from the past.
It's almost like a time travel paradox, isn't it? We feel so certain about our current understanding of the world, but history keeps reminding us that what seems like absolute truth in one era can be completely reinterpreted in another.
Totally.
What are some things, things we consider normal now that future generations might find strange?
Oh, there's so many. I'm sure they'll look back at our social media obsession and be like, what were those people thinking?
It's true. I can't even imagine trying to explain something like Instagram to someone who lived 100 years ago.
They would think we were crazy.
Exactly. And that's precisely the point the source is making. What we consider normal is constantly evolving, and our understanding of truth evolves right along with it.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it like that. So how do we navigate this ever-shifting landscape of truth? It feels like a tightrope walk, trying to find our balance.
It's definitely a challenge. And speaking of challenges, the source also delves into how Jesus's parables, while relatable, were actually seen as pretty radical for their time. Remember how some people viewed him as a manipulator?
Yeah, it's almost like calling someone a manipulator back then was the equivalent of calling them fake news today.
That's a spot-on analogy. The source explains that Jesus's teachings, especially those about love and forgiveness, directly challenge the existing power structures. The Romans and Pharisees, they felt like he was undermining their authority. That's why they tried so hard to discredit him.
It makes you wonder how many truths throughout history have been silenced or distorted simply because they threaten those in power. It's a sobering thought. Do you think we still see this happening today?
Oh, absolutely. Just think about how information is controlled and manipulated in different parts of the world. Even in societies that, pride themselves on having a free press, there are still these subtle biases and agendas at play. It's a constant reminder that we need to be critical thinkers and seek out diverse perspectives.
Speaking of diverse perspectives, I love how the source connects this idea of challenging authority to modern examples.
Yeah.
It even compares Jesus to figures like Galileo, who, was persecuted for his scientific discoveries.
What's fascinating is how the source highlights the parallels between those historical figures and modern-day whistleblowers or activists who challenge the status quo today. They often face similar pushback and accusations, even when they're trying to do the right thing.
Right. It's like history repeating itself in a way. It really makes you question who decides what's truth and what's manipulation. Is it about the intention behind the message or the impact it has on people?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we all have to grapple with, especially today when we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
Absolutely. The source also uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate this whole idea of the evolution of truth. It talks about how future generations might look back at our current societal norms with the same kind of bewilderment we might feel when looking at practices from centuries ago.
It's such a powerful image. It reminds us that what we consider true today is often a product of our time and cultural context. What seems obvious or unshakable now might be seen as totally outdated or even absurd in the future.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it?
It is. Do you have any guesses about what future generations might find strange about our current society? I mean, besides the whole social media thing, which we've already touched on.
That's a tough one. There are so many possibilities. Maybe they'll look back at our reliance on technology and wonder how we ever survived without constant connectivity.
That's a good one. Or maybe they'll be baffled by our consumerist culture and the sheer amount of stuff we accumulate.
Or our obsession with self-improvement and optimization. Maybe they'll value simplicity and connection more than we do.
Those are all really insightful points. And they all point back to this core idea that what we consider normal is constantly in flux. Our understanding of truth is evolving right alongside it.
It's almost like we're all on this grand adventure of discovery, constantly learning and unlearning as we go.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those humorous anecdotes about that modern-day political leader and their, shall we say, unconventional communication style. Remember those?
Oh yeah, those were classic. Let's revisit those because they're a perfect example of how even the most carefully crafted message can be interpreted in a million different ways, especially in the age of social media.
Right, and how sometimes a single word or phrase can unintentionally become a cultural phenomenon.
Remember that story about the politician responding Rueda to a young person asking for advice? I'm still curious about how that played out in the media and online.
Well, the source describes how the response instantly went viral. Some people, of course, found it hilarious.
I mean, I kind of did.
Right. Others thought it was really dismissive, and still others tried to read some deeper philosophical meaning into it. It basically became this Rorschach test where everyone projected their own interpretations onto it.
It's fascinating how a single word can spark such a wide range of reactions and become a meme overnight. It really highlights the unpredictable nature of communication, especially in the digital age.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that even when we try to be clear and concise, our messages can still be taken out of context, misinterpreted, or even used to further agendas that have nothing to do with our original intent.
It's almost like we're all playing a game of telephone, where the message gets distorted with each retelling.
That's a perfect analogy. And it really underscores the importance of being mindful of our own communication, both online and offline. We need to be aware of how our words might be perceived by others, especially in a world where everything we say or do can be amplified and analyzed instantly.
So as we navigate this complex world of storytelling, truth, and this ever-evolving landscape of communication, what are some key takeaways we can apply to our own lives?
Well, I think one of the most powerful takeaways for me is this whole idea that truth is dynamic. It's not like this fixed point. It's more like a process, constantly evolving. Just like scientific discoveries change over time, societal norms change, our understanding of truth also shifts and expands.
So then how do we hold on to any sense of certainty when it feels like the ground beneath us is constantly shifting? It's kind of overwhelming, isn't it?
The source doesn't really suggest that we should be clinging to, rigid certainty. Instead, it encourages us to kind of embrace the discomfort of uncertainty. It's more about being open to new information, being willing to maybe revise our beliefs and just accepting that there might not always be easy answers.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like instead of trying to grasp onto this solid rock, we're learning to surf, on the waves of information and different perspectives that are constantly coming at us.
That is a fantastic way to put it. And that's where, critical thinking becomes so important. The source really emphasizes that we're not just these passive recipients of information. We have the power to question things, analyze, and evaluate the information that we're encountering.
So it's not about becoming cynical or distrusting everything, but more about developing this healthy sense of skepticism.
Right.
We should be asking ourselves, who's telling this story?
Yeah.
What's their agenda? What information might be missing?
Exactly. And the source actually gives some practical tips for how we can cultivate this kind of critical thinking. For example, it encourages us to diversify our sources of information. Don't just rely on one news outlet or one social media platform.
It's like getting a second opinion from a doctor. You want to make sure you're getting a well-rounded perspective, not just one narrow viewpoint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another really key tip is to be mindful of that thing called confirmation bias, that human tendency we all have to seek out information that confirms what we already believe. So the source suggests actively seeking out perspectives that challenge our own, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
It's like that saying, if you're always the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Precisely. And you know what else the source reminds us? Engaging in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views can be incredibly enriching. It's not about trying to win an argument or convert someone to our way of thinking, but rather about listening, learning, and maybe expanding our own understanding a little bit.
It's like we're all these different pieces of a puzzle. And by connecting with people who have different experiences and perspectives, we can start to see that bigger picture.
That's a beautiful analogy. And ultimately, you know what the source suggests. Embracing this approach to truth can actually lead us to greater empathy, understanding, and even wisdom.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into storytelling, truth, and this kind of surprising connection to TikTok, it seems like the biggest takeaway isn't about finding those definitive answers, but more about embracing this journey of lifelong learning and critical thinking.
And remembering that truth is kind of like this multifaceted gem, constantly reflecting new light as we turn it over and over in our hands.
I love that. What a fantastic way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the topics that matter most. It feels like we've really uncovered some gems in this deep dive, about how stories shape our understanding of truth. What really hit home for me is how the source emphasizes that this isn't just some ancient history lesson. It's like directly relevant to how we navigate the world today. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And one of the most, I think, powerful takeaways for me is how the source really drives home this idea that truth is dynamic. It's not a fixed point. It's a constantly evolving process. Just like scientific discoveries change over time, societal norms, all that stuff, our understanding of truth also shifts and expands.
Okay, but then how do we hold on to any sense of certainty when the ground beneath us feels like it's constantly shifting? I don't know about you, but it's a bit overwhelming at times.
Yeah, I get it. It can definitely feel that way. The source, though, doesn't suggest that we should be clinging to rigid certainty. Instead, it encourages us to kind of, embrace the discomfort of uncertainty. It's more about being open to new information, being willing to maybe revise our beliefs, and just accepting that there might not always be those easy answers.
That makes sense. So it's like, instead of trying to grasp onto a solid rock, we're learning to surf, on the waves of information and all those different perspectives that are coming at us all the time.
I love that analogy. That's a great way to put it. And that's really where critical thinking comes into play. The source emphasizes that we're not just these passive recipients of information. We have the power to question things, to analyze, to evaluate the information we're encountering.
So it's not about becoming cynical or, distrusting everything. It's more about developing a healthy sense of skepticism, I guess. We should be asking ourselves, who's telling this story? What's their agenda? What information might be missing from this?
Exactly. And the source even provides practical tips for how we can actually cultivate this kind of critical thinking. For example, it encourages us to diversify our sources of information. Don't just rely on one news outlet or one social media platform. Branch out.
Right. It's almost like getting a second opinion from a doctor. You want to make sure you're getting a well-rounded perspective, not just one narrow viewpoint.
Exactly. And another really important tip is to be mindful of confirmation bias. Have you heard of that? It's that human tendency we all have to seek out information that confirms what we already believe. So the source really suggests actively seeking out perspectives that challenge our own, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
Right. It's like that saying, if you're always the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Precisely. And another thing the source reminds us of is that engaging in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views can be incredibly enriching. It's not about, trying to win an argument or convert someone to our way of thinking, but more about listening, learning, and maybe expanding our own understanding of it.
Yeah. It's like we're all these different pieces of a puzzle.
Right.
And by connecting with people who have different experiences and different perspectives, we can start to see the bigger picture.
That's a beautiful analogy. And ultimately, the source suggests that embracing this approach to truth can actually lead us to greater empathy, understanding, and even wisdom.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today into storytelling, truth, and who knew? This unexpected connection to TikTok, it seems like the most important lesson isn't about finding those definitive answers, but more about embracing this journey of lifelong learning
Right.
and critical thinking.
And remembering that truth is kind of like this multifaceted gem, constantly reflecting new light as we turn it over and over in our hands.
I love that. What a fantastic way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration. And as always, be sure to subscribe to the show for more deep dives into the topics that matter most. Until next time.